My daughter's name is Lily Grace. One thing I remember that just really makes me smile is that she was so tiny, but her feet were weirdly big compared to the rest of her body.
Welcome to Still a Part of Us, a place where moms and dads share the story of their child who was stillborn or who died in infancy. I'm Winter.
And I'm Lee. We are grateful you joined us today. Please note that this is a story of loss and has triggers.
Thanks to our lost parents who are willing to be vulnerable and share their children with us.
If you're listening to this podcast, just know that on our YouTube channel there are pictures and videos that are related to the stories that are being shared.
Subscribe and share it with a friend that might need it and tell them to subscribe. Why? Because people need to know that even though our babies are no longer with us, they're still a part of us. Michelle, thank you so much for coming on. We're so excited to hear about your little Lily. And so thank you so much for taking the time out of your busy schedule to tell her story.
Yeah, thank you so much. I'm so excited to get to talk about her.
Yeah. So tell us a little bit about yourself, like where are you guys located? What does your family look like now and maybe even at the time of Lily's birth?
Yeah. So I live in Pittsburgh with my husband, Chris, and we were living here at the time of Lily's birth and our pregnancy with her as well. And our family looks like Chris and I, our dog Milo, Lily, and I'm actually 21 weeks pregnant with Lily's little brother right now.
Oh, you are? Oh, wow.
Yeah.
Okay. That's thank you for coming on during this time. This is really Michelle, I am very it's no easy feat being pregnant after a loss. So thank you so much for coming on again.
Yeah, of
Um
course.
and what do you and Chris do? Tell us what you guys do maybe professionally or in your spare time that you like to do as hobbies as a family or by yourself?
Yeah. So I actually am a pediatrician. I was a pediatric resident at the time that Lily was born, which meant I worked a lot of hours at crazy times. So didn't have a lot of time for hobbies. And then Chris is a high school teacher. And we like to just spend a lot of time outside. We like to take our dog for hikes and walks. We like to bike some and then, yeah, just spend a lot of time playing with our dog.
That is so great. So just a lot of activity and you guys are busy. And I'm sure that you are probably really crazy with your hours. And then Chris has probably very naturally occurring hours.
Yeah, his are a lot more consistent.
Yeah. Okay. That sounds great. Well, thank you. And then at the time of this recording, just so we have a little point of reference, how
Yeah.
long ago, how many months ago was Lily born?
We just passed our 1 year anniversary of her birthday. So she was born 1 year and 1 week ago.
Oh, wow. Yeah, it's it's so kind of new still. I personally
Yeah.
think it is still very fresh. So thank you for telling us a little bit about yourself. And were you guys planning on getting pregnant? Was this something that was on your radar? You said you were a pediatric resident when you were pregnant, and that does not seem like super conducive good time to be pregnant. But everybody has their own decisions to make in their lives. So, was that something you guys intentionally planned, or was that a surprise?
Yeah, we did plan actually. We had just started trying and we were really lucky. We didn't have fertility issues, which I was just completely convinced that we would. So it was a surprise a surprise in a sense, but we were trying.
Yeah, awesome. And let's tell me a little bit about how that one when you guys first found out that you were pregnant. So you were planning on it. You were a little surprised that it was kind of easier, right?
Yeah.
So were you like excited, nervous? Like I'm sure you were like, oh man, this is an additional thing that you're
Yeah.
going to.
It was definitely a little bit overwhelming and exciting. It was kind of funny. I actually found out when I was on an away rotation about 4 hours away from Pittsburgh, which is unusual. It was the only time I did it, one time for 6 weeks. And I was there when I found out I was pregnant.
Oh,
And I kind of took a test one morning just 'cause I was like, I need to stop thinking about this, thinking that it was too early to test. And then I was really surprised when it was positive.
oh,
But I wasn't with Chris, which is kind of a bummer. So I told him a couple days later when I came home for the
oh, you
weekend.
okay, good. Because I was like, how did you tell him? Like, did you
Yeah.
call him or okay? So you
Yeah.
told him when you came home for a minute. So
Yeah.
okay, well, good deal. And was he super excited? I'm sure he was.
Yeah, he was super excited. He was also really surprised, but because he also thought that I wasn't even going to be testing yet. So yeah, we were both just really excited. It was a fun time.
Wonderful. Yeah,
Yeah.
it is always kind of like, yay, that's just yeah, it's a super fun time. So, how did your pregnancy go? Like did you go into the hospital? Sorry, did you go get a checkup? When did they yeah, when did you first go in? At what week did you go in to kind of have everything looked at, checked out?
Yeah. So my pregnancy was kind of complicated right from the beginning.
Mm.
So had I started to have a little bit of spotting, like I don't a week or so maybe after I had a positive pregnancy test,
Oh.
and then started to have a little bit of pain. And so I called my OB, who I had made an appointment with for like 12 weeks, but hadn't even been in to see yet. And I was 4 hours away, and they told me to go get an ultrasound there, to make sure I didn't have an ectopic pregnancy.
Mm, mhm.
Um, so I went in and got that, and thinking I was about 5 weeks or so, I think is what I thought. And then I went in and it wasn't an ectopic pregnancy, was great, which was great. And there was a heartbeat, which we didn't expect, thinking we were 5 weeks, and we were 8 weeks pregnant.
Oh,
Um, yeah, so I had what I had thought had been a period, but it apparently was not. So that was like a kind of a fun surprise that we got
yeah.
to fast forward 3 weeks through the first trimester.
Yeah. Were you feeling
Yeah.
sick at all, actually?
No, like a little bit nauseous, which is what made me like
Mm.
want to take that test, but not bad. I really was feeling pretty good. So yeah, it was definitely a surprise.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, so everything looks okay. They just maybe did they attribute the spotting to anything in particular?
No, they just thought at that point that it was like not too much. And so they thought it's within normal first trimester spotting. And so at
Okay.
that point, just weren't very concerned.
Okay.
Um, and so said to come back at I believe it was a 12-week appointment that I had scheduled.
Great. Were
Yeah.
you back from your away rotation by that time that you went in for your 12-week?
I was, and that was not the next time we were seen.
Oh
So,
no. Okay. Tell me
no,
more then.
yeah, that's all right. So we had scheduled the 12-week appointment, but then had also wanted to do the first trimester screening, and just the way scheduling worked out, that was going to be at 11 weeks in a couple days. So that was actually going to be first, and we were so excited to because I had gotten an ultrasound, but Chris hadn't been there. So we were so excited to go to an ultrasound together. And then the morning actually of my first trimester screen, like early that morning at like 3 or 4 in the morning, I woke up and had a lot of bleeding.
Oh.
And it was really dramatic. And Chris and I were both 100% convinced that we had miscarried. Like there
Mm.
was no way in our mind that that wasn't what happened. And
Yeah.
we were completely heartbroken. And so my appointment was for like 7 o'clock that morning. And I had been trying to get in touch with the OB on call, but I was like not particularly familiar with the practice yet. So I didn't really know how the system worked, but we just skipped the appointment because we are like, we're not going to go in. Like, what's the point?
Yeah.
And we hadn't been able to get in touch with them yet at our like 7 o'clock appointment. And then later that morning, so we were just home and really sad. And then they called back and said, well, we really should have you go get an ultrasound. And I just remember being so upset that they were going to force us to go to a waiting room with a bunch of happy pregnant people and get an ultrasound to find out what we already knew. And so I was kind of upset, but okay, fine, we'll do it. So they got us in for another ultrasound, like an emergency ultrasound appointment later that morning. And we went in, and it was pretty excruciating to like sit in the waiting room and wait for that. And then we went in. I remember them asking, like, "Oh, what brings you in?" And we were like, "Well, I think I'm miscarrying." So, and then they put the ultrasound probe on. I didn't even look at the screen because I didn't want to see. And they were like, well, there's a heartbeat. Everything looks good. And like, we were just like completely shocked because neither of us, I think, had any amount of hope. We were just
Oh,
completely convinced that
yeah.
we had lost the baby.
Okay, but did they attribute any of the bleeding that time to anything, like a hemorrhage or like what
Yeah.
the
It was
subchorionic
weird
hemorrhage?
because they said they should have been able to see if it was a subchorionic hemorrhage. They should have still been able to see a little bit of evidence of that, but they couldn't. But that was kind of the best guess. But they said there doesn't look to be any ongoing bleeding. Like there was no signs in my placenta or anything at that point that they could tell, which was kind of unsatisfying.
Oh,
um,
yeah.
but also like reassuring and unsatisfying
Yeah.
at the same time.
Oh man, I like the amount of emotions that you guys probably felt that day in like what,
Yeah.
7, 8 hours or something
Yeah,
is
it was exhausting for sure. Yeah, we both just were like, this is the biggest emotional roller coaster up to
yeah.
that point that we had been on.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, so that was around 11, a little
Hmm.
a little over 11 weeks when you went in for that.
Yeah.
But you didn't go to the actual OB appointment. You just got that ultrasound.
Yeah, I still hadn't been to the OB until a few days later.
Okay, so you did
Um,
get an appointment
yep.
and okay. And
Yep.
so how was the bleeding kind of subsiding, gone?
Yeah, the bleeding it lasted for a couple weeks, I think, but it was much less. It was much, much less. It was like a ton all at once and then was like spotting again. So they were like, well, I was like, so does this mean that my risk is the same as anyone else's risk? And they're like, well, we always prefer people don't have bleeding, but we like there's nothing to show that anything looks concerning necessarily right now. And so we'll just like continue. And at that point, I was 12 weeks, which, is supposed to feel like the time when things feel safer. Um, but yeah, it took us a while to like actually feel hopeful or confident at all again. I would say it took us a good probably few weeks to a month to actually kind of settle in again to thinking that
And
it might
getting
actually
excited.
happen.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. And we had been about to tell people at 12 weeks. And then we, yeah, delayed that a little bit. We still told our families,
Mhm.
but we delayed telling other people till I think like 17 or so, 16 or 17 weeks.
Okay, so just a little bit later then. And tell me, I forgot to ask this. Where are you guys both from Pennsylvania area, or are you like I just wasn't sure, like did you call your family and let them know,
Yeah.
or
Yeah, so Chris's family lives in Pittsburgh. They're all
Okay.
really close by. I'm from Colorado originally, and
Oh,
so my
okay.
parents are still in Colorado. Um, so my poor mom, I called my mom on the morning that I thought I miscarried
Yeah.
to tell her that I had had a miscarriage. And then called her back later that day and was like, just kidding, I guess. So that's
So
how she got
maybe
to find out, which was not
Oh,
how we would have wanted.
yeah. Yeah.
But yeah, and then we told Chris's parents a few days later and the rest of his family, which that was fun. And so that it was fun to get to tell them in person. And
Oh,
that
good.
was like a little piece of pregnancy normalcy that we got
Yeah.
there.
Okay, so that is looking good. Are you guys doing any sort of genetic testing? Because it usually, I mean, you can get it around that time if you wanted to do genetic testing.
Yeah. So when we had gone in for the ultrasound on the day we were supposed to have our first trimester
Mm-hmm.
screen with like the nuchal translucency and the blood work, they were like, they said, everything looks good. I was like, okay, well then while we're here, can you still do the nuchal translucency? And they were able to, which was nice. And I got the blood work and not really thinking anything of it. And then about a week later, so after I had seen my OB, we got the call that it came back as high risk for trisomy 21. And so then they
Oh.
recommended the genetic testing, which we got. And then that came back normal about another week or so later. So there was another little roller coaster bump in
Oh
there.
man, yeah. Okay,
Yeah.
really quickly before, just to clarify, can
Yeah.
you explain what a nuchal transparency is so that others know what that is,
Oh,
and then
yeah.
what would lead you to go on and get the genetic testing? Yeah.
Yeah, of course. So it's the first trimester screen is lab work that they get a bunch of labs on at the same time that you get an ultrasound that looks at the nuchal translucency is like the thickness on the back of baby's neck at some particular measurement. And then I think they put in your age and everything, and any other risk factors into a calculator with the nuchal translucency measurement, as well as the lab work. And they calculate out your risk for different genetic abnormalities.
Yeah. And so that, which led you to like, oh, you're probably a little higher risk. And so go ahead and get the genetic testing.
Yeah.
And what did the genetic testing come back as?
Yeah. So it came back as normal chromosomes, no trisomy 21. And we were not finding out the gender. So we didn't look at the, whether it was a boy or girl. So I had my OB call me with those results, even though they were on my phone, but I didn't want to open them because they said it would be very obvious if it was a boy or girl when I opened those. So we didn't look at that.
That is really fun. I think that's like the ultimate surprise. Like,
boy,
girl. Which, were you guys hoping for a boy or girl? Was there? Did it matter? Were you guys excited?
No, we didn't really, I don't think, have a preference, but we were having an easier time with boy names. Like we kind of had one boy name picked out, so then we thought it might be a girl, and but not really. We didn't. And neither of us had like strong feelings that it was one or the other.
Okay. Well, fun still. Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. So, you've had that come back. That was okay. And then your next one would probably be the major one would probably be the anatomy scan at 20 weeks, around 20 weeks. Is that, did you have it around that time?
Yep. We had it at 20 weeks. And so like in between that time, we had finally had like a little bit of normalcy, and started to feel hopeful again. And we're like, okay, that bleed is behind us. There's no reason to think anything is wrong.
And you're feeling okay too. Like,
yeah, I actually
nausea.
felt physically really great
Okay.
throughout. I never really had much nausea. I was really lucky in that way. And was feeling good. We went on a big trip, like right at the end of my first trimester, went hiking through a bunch of national parks, which was probably a bold move, knowing how sick I've been this pregnancy, but it worked out fine because I felt great during that pregnancy.
Yeah.
And so we did a ton of hiking and it was really fun. Yeah. So that was like a little sweet spot and leading up to the 20-week ultrasound. So then we went into the ultrasound and of course knew that they could find things wrong, but weren't really worried about it. I was more convinced of wanting to have a surprise on the sex of the baby. So I was really worried about accidentally finding out. That I feel like was my worry going into the scan. And then they were going through all the things. They kept pointing out all the organs that looked good, which was great. And it was my first anatomy scan ever. So I didn't really think anything of how long she was taking on some of the things. Didn't think much of it when the tech stepped out of the room a few times and came back, and had noticed when they measure like all of they measure their leg length and their head circumference, and at least where we get our ultrasounds done, it shows like how many weeks they're estimated to be based on those measurements.
Yeah.
And we had noticed like that they seemed a little bit behind, like it was fewer weeks than 20 weeks what we were, but I wasn't really paying that much attention. But I had noticed a couple of those. And then
like a lot of weeks behind, like give me.
I had only noticed a couple that looked like 19 weeks or like 18 weeks and like 6 days or something. So nothing that seemed too alarming to me.
Okay.
And then the tech left the room again. And at that point, and was like, there might be some more images we need to get. Baby wasn't being the most cooperative, so we couldn't get quite all of the things that they needed to. So I thought that was it, that they just like wanted to get a more experienced tech that was going to have different tricks up their sleeve to get the different angles. Like I think they couldn't get her spine. And so I didn't think too much of it. And then she came back in with the doctor who I would say it wasn't my best experience with a doctor that I've had during this time. But she basically was like, your baby's way too small. And that is a really bad sign that they're way too small at this time. And that can mean a bunch of different things. And you'll talk to your OB about it. And kind of left it at that. I think she also thought that since I am a physician, that my knowledge was different than what, but I'm not an OB. And
Yeah.
in that moment, it wouldn't have mattered if I was an OB, like I was a patient and I was a mom. So
Yeah.
that was really, really scary. And actually, like the measurement, like when we got the final report with the measurements, some of them were like 17 weeks, like already like very far behind. I hadn't noticed those when they were going through it, but she was really, really small.
And that's
So
all she said. She just basically said, "You gotta go talk to your OB about it." Like, there was
I mean, she said like it could be infection, it could be genetic, it could be the placenta. And was like, so you'll figure out next steps with your OB to figure it out. That's at least what I remember. I also recognize that it was a traumatic moment.
Right.
But that's how it felt to me.
Yeah,
Um, yeah,
definitely. Yeah, it is. Yeah. You're like, "What just happened?"
yeah, yeah. And
Okay.
it was like everything looked good. Like I think that's what was so surprising too, is that like all the organs and everything looked good that we saw. There were a couple that we couldn't get that time, but
In
yeah,
general, everything else looks good.
everything looked good. Yeah. And we actually had to have a dedicated fetal echo too of her heart because
Mm.
I have a heart condition that can be inherited. And so that was like already pre-planned that we would get that. So we actually had that right after the anatomy ultrasound. We went there. The heart looked perfect.
Mm.
They were like, well, from that perspective, like everything looks fine. Baby looks great, which was good, I guess. But at that point, it was just really scary.
Yeah.
Um,
Talk about worry setting in. Again, so then you have this knowledge that something may be up, and did you guys have a follow-up appointment with your OB shortly after? Were you able to get in that quickly?
so we got in, I think a few days later, but we talked to them later
Mm.
that day, which felt like an eternity trying to get a hold of someone that day. But we did hear from them later that day. And they were kind of like, well, you were a little bit unsure about your dating at first. And so, but they were like, and also your genetic testing, you already had that and that was fine. So they were like, well, let's just see like if baby is tracking, we'll get another ultrasound in like 3 to 4 weeks. And if baby is tracking on the same growth curve, then it's probably not a whole lot to worry about. And they, in the meantime, had me do a bunch of lab tests to see if I'd been infected. And like I hadn't been sick at all, but just to make sure that I hadn't gotten infected with something that I hadn't
Right.
realized, which that all came back normal as well.
Okay.
But they also wanted me to see MFM or the high risk OBs in the meantime as well.
When you did finally get to talk to your doctor, I mean, so that was kind of the conclusion, like, we're gonna
Yeah.
check back in 3 to 4 weeks,
Yeah.
ultimately.
Yeah.
And how did she look then?
Yeah. So we had met with MFM about a week after that ultrasound too. And we had kind of felt a little more reassured after talking to ROB of like,
Mhm.
okay, this baby's just going to be small. Like, I the babies in my family weren't particularly small, but Chris and his sisters, like they were all small. I was like, it's just gonna be a small baby. Everything's gonna be fine.
Okay.
And then we met with MFM, and at that point, they said, in hindsight, now knowing that she wasn't growing well, they looked back at that first trimester screen lab work that had been abnormal. And they said, well, it flagged as high risk for trisomy 21, which the baby doesn't have based on the genetics, but the one marker that was the most abnormal is an indicator that the placenta is struggling. So they really thought that
Oh.
the growth restriction was because of the placenta at that point, which also fit with there was no sign of infection and her
Mhm.
genetics had looked good. And she had no other anatomic concerns that made genetics seem super likely. And what she also told us was because it was likely the placenta, that I was like, so in best case scenario, baby just grows and is small. And she said, realistic best case scenario is you get to 31 or 32 weeks and develop preeclampsia,
Oh,
and need
best case
to,
scenario.
yeah, and need to, or just hypertension, maybe
Yeah.
not necessarily preeclampsia,
Right.
and need to deliver because of like because the placenta is not working and then it causing problems to my health.
Yeah. Okay.
Um, so that was a lot to take in. That like readjusting our like goal to be 31, 32 weeks.
Yeah, because
Um,
that is a huge time difference, like a huge time difference.
yeah,
Yeah, I
yeah. And like I have worked in the NICU, I've taken care of premature babies. And so I know that 31, 32 week baby, I was just kept trying to tell Chris, like, most of those babies do great. Like, I know not all of them do great, but most of them really do. It'll be okay. Like, it'll be a long NICU stay and that'll be really hard, but like, that's okay. And we actually had gone to Colorado to visit my parents like
mhm.
during this time too. And I just like have vivid memories of conversations we had like while hiking and things in Colorado of just really trying to process what our new reality might look like.
Yeah. So they kinda gave you, the possible solution I mean, not possible the possibility that at 31, 32 weeks, you'd be delivering. Did they give you the worst case scenario? Did they talk about any of that with you?
Um, they did. They had said we were at higher risk of stillbirth, but didn't really like not that I remember like quantified what how high. And like
Mhm.
they did make clear like they weren't sure that we would make it to 32 weeks before baby started being in distress.
Yeah,
But they were like, we'll just have to see, like, we'll see what the growth shows at 23 weeks, and kind of go from there.
okay. So, you came back from your trip, I'm assuming from Colorado, had
Mhm.
that 23, 24-week ultrasound. How did she look then?
So she was even smaller. I mean, she
Oh,
was growing, but she was like falling off of her curve. So she was
yeah.
more behind, which was really hard. And that time we were paying very close attention to all the measurements on the screen and how many weeks. So we kind of knew, we were like, oh, well, she's bigger, but we knew that things were not what we had hoped that I think it was right about 3 weeks, and we had hoped that she had grown exactly we had hoped that she had grown exactly 3 weeks during that time. And we could tell by our own watching the measurements that that wasn't true. And then the other thing they did at that ultrasound, because of her growth restriction, was they did a Doppler of the umbilical artery to look
Yes.
at whether they look for, well, what she ended up having was reversed end diastolic flow. So, like at different parts of the heart rate, blood, instead of going to her through the umbilical cord, was coming from her because of the placenta being so sick or so bad.
Oh. So they were able to see that happening at that time.
Yeah, which is what they hadn't explicitly told us that that was like the thing they were looking for that was going to be bad. Um, but I had remembered from medical school, I was like, that's bad. And we actually had gotten that ultrasound at a different hospital, where MFM wasn't, and where ROB wasn't. And so the tech had tried to call them to figure out our next steps, but she wasn't able to get in touch with them. So she said, you guys can just go ahead and go home and they will call you shortly. Like, I paged them, they'll be calling you
Mhm.
shortly, but you don't need to wait here because it's not a hospital that does OB except for the ultrasounds. So we went out to the parking garage, and then I got a call while we were in the car from MFM that said, you need to come to triage right away, because of the reverse end diastolic flow. So just like try to come straight here. And I just remember at that point when I hung up the phone, just like breaking down, that like, I just remember saying to Chris, like, I don't think we're going to be able to bring this baby home. Sorry. Um, so yeah, that was a really bad day. Um, so then we headed straight to triage. It was only like a 10-minute drive between the two hospitals. And we went straight to triage. And again, a similar situation of waiting in the waiting room, with all these women with their packed bags and their big bellies, and smiles on their faces, and us just really scared. Um, and we got into triage, and fortunately the doctor that was there was just so kind, and all the nursing
Oh,
staff, everybody was so kind that day. And what she said is that the reverse end diastolic flow is a really bad sign that the placenta is failing. Um, and that the baby didn't look to be in any distress at that point, which was great. They had done a biophysical profile too, I guess, which like measures the wellness of the baby, doing a bunch of different things. And she had gotten a four full points there. So they
yeah.
said she's not in any distress now, but she could be at any time. And so they actually recommended admission to until delivery at that point.
And you were at 23
It
weeks.
was at 23 and 2.
23 and 2. Okay.
Yeah. And so our hospital offers resuscitation starting at 23 weeks.
Okay.
So they actually, so I said, because I have been in the NICU and I've taken care of kids long after the NICU that are born that early. And I know that the outcomes are really not always the best. And so I said, well, what if we wouldn't want resuscitation this early? Do we still need to be admitted? And they said, no, if you wouldn't want resuscitation, there's no need to admit, but like talk to our NICU team while you're here, which was great. So they had the NICU team come to talk to us in triage, which is just an odd dynamic. It's like they were people I knew, had worked with. Um, and they kind of talked to us about all the risks of prematurity to that degree. And the hard thing too was she wasn't only just 23 weeks at that point, she was also really small.
Right.
And so I remember they had a calculator that they like calculated their outcomes based on a number of factors. And the lowest weight on the calculator was higher than her estimated weight at
Oh,
that point. So they couldn't even put her in. And they weren't sure if we delivered then, if they would even have equipment small enough.
to
Because she
do
was just
anything.
so small. And so that began the worst decision ever. Um, sorry. Um, we had to work with our teams with MFM and with NICU, and most importantly, with Chris and I to figure out at what gestational age, given how tiny she was, at what gestational age we would want to be, that we would want resuscitation and would want to deliver her, with the plan to be that there was no need to be in the hospital before then because there's no need to monitor for distress, if you're not going to do anything about it. And that just adds a lot of stress to us
Yeah.
to be in the hospital just waiting for something terrible to happen for weeks.
Yeah.
And so that appointment, that ultrasound and that triage visit was on a Friday. And then I think we had an appointment again with MFM and NICU on the following Tuesday, kind of after we'd had a little bit of time to process it as best we
Yeah.
could, and think about it and consider all the options. Which, I mean, they had offered the option of ending the pregnancy as well at that point. In Pennsylvania, it's legal until 24 weeks. So we had like a 5-day window. And we did consider it, which I just say because people don't know until they're faced with horrible decisions. Um, and ultimately, because my health still looked good at that point, my blood pressure was still okay. My OBs were not worried about my health, that it seemed worth it to continue with the pregnancy, to give baby a shot at making it until a later age, when they would have a good chance. Um, And so anyway, at that appointment, a few days later, when we met with all of them, we had a ton more discussions about the details of risks to me, to the baby, of what outcomes would look like. And of course, it's just so hard to predict. They can't tell me,
Yeah.
they just can't tell you if your baby's going to be one that is a miracle baby in the NICU that has no problems despite having
Right.
all the odds against them, or if they're going to just suffer a lot. And we ultimately decided on 28 weeks as, and like with the anticipated extra growth that we thought she might get in that time, we had decided on 28 weeks. That was the plan. And MFM had offered me to come in for like weekly heart check because I wasn't feeling a ton of movement. I had felt some kicks and Chris got to feel some kicks, but because she was so small and it was still early,
Yeah.
I wasn't feeling a ton. And so there wasn't going to be a ton to tell me that things were going okay or
Yeah.
the baby. And by that, I mean, just the baby was even still alive.
Yeah.
And so they offered me to come in weekly to check just that there was a heartbeat, just so that I didn't have to wait a full 3 weeks or 4 weeks, whatever it was, just at home wondering. And so we did that. I went in every week for heart tone checks, and there was a heartbeat. And then the plan was to get another growth ultrasound at 26 weeks. That was the plan. So I think there
Okay.
was just 2 weeks where I needed the heart tone checks in between.
Okay. Okay.
And so I had gone in at 24 weeks and 25 weeks, and listened to baby's heartbeat, and it sounded great each time, but it was just the most agonizing weeks, of trying to decide if we made the right decision, just wondering at all times, like, should we go in now? And just waiting for those next appointments. And then we had our next growth scan, our 26 weeks scan was scheduled, the Tuesday after Labor Day. I was 26 and 6 at that appointment. And my anxiety was extremely high.
Yeah.
And my blood pressure was getting higher too, which
Okay.
didn't help my anxiety,
Yeah.
and vice versa.
Yes.
I just remember talking to Chris over Labor Day weekend. We had been, when we were deciding on what gestational age, like the 26 to 28 week range was where it was really hard for us to figure out what the right decision was. Um, we felt pretty confident that like at 23 weeks with how tiny she was, that she didn't have a good chance, but we weren't sure at the 26 to 28 week range. And so we had decided that if we went in for that ultrasound and she was showing any signs of distress, that we would just get admitted to the hospital and induce. And so that was a really long weekend.
Yeah.
3 days never felt so long. And I was just sick to my stomach, with anxiety, especially like that night before. I don't think I slept at all. I swear I felt a kick, that night. I don't know if it was a kick or not, but I swear I felt a kick. Thankfully, our ultrasound was the very first thing in the morning. It was another like 7 a.m. scan. Um, and we went in, and fortunately, the waiting room was empty because it was so early.
Yeah.
And they took us back for the ultrasound. And at this point, we'd had a number of ultrasounds, so both of us were getting better at looking at things.
Yeah.
The tech just kind of really quickly moved through things. And I remember thinking, it doesn't really look like baby's moving, but she wasn't really a big mover on ultrasound. So she was
Mm.
often pretty still. So I was like, no, like, I don't know. I can't tell. And then I definitely didn't see her stop a heartbeat, but like, I wasn't sure. And then when they like show the flat, like the wiggly lines where
Yeah.
you expect to see the heartbeat, she just did it really quickly. And I was like, I don't think it looks right. But I wasn't totally sure. And then she started doing some measurements. And so I was like, well, maybe everything is okay, because why would she do measurements if there wasn't a heartbeat? Um, and so she did a quick measurement of the head and femurs. And I remember thinking like, okay, she grew again. Like I could tell again, like falling farther behind, but had still grown since the last ultrasound.
Yeah.
I was like, it's just, I don't know, something doesn't seem right, but she's still measuring. But then she only measured like 2 measurements, and we had done these. We knew that they did a lot of measurements when they're
Yeah.
doing a growth ultrasound. And she said, okay, I got all I need. So I'm
Oh.
going to go get the doctor and they'll be in to talk to you. And at that point, I knew like they did not get everything they need. Well, they did get everything they needed, but,
Yeah.
and when she stepped out, Chris and I just looked at each other, and I don't know who said it first, but one of us said, I don't think there was a heartbeat. And the other one like said the same. Um, and so then the doctor came in, and she was also so lovely and kind. And she just said, I have bad news. And I said, there's not a heartbeat. And she said, yeah, there's not a heartbeat. Um, and at that point, we just completely fell apart. We stayed in the ultrasound room for a while, just crying, and the doctor kind of came and went, like giving us time and checking in. And um, she um, asked if we wanted to talk about next steps or if we wanted to go home. And I remember Chris, like, and then she stepped out to give us time. And I remember Chris being like, what next steps? Like, the baby died. Like, I was like, I'm gonna have to deliver the baby still. And so eventually they moved us to another room, which was nice to not be in that ultrasound room anymore. Um, it was just like an office with a desk. I don't think it was a patient room at all. Um, and again, kind of like, I don't know, time was such a blur, so I have no idea. But the doctor came, kind of just like kept coming in and checking and leaving, to like see where we were at in terms of being ready to discuss next steps. And at one point during that, when she had stepped out, we decided we didn't want to surprise anymore in terms of the sex. That didn't seem fun at that point. And so and the answer was on my phone. It had always been on my phone. I just hadn't looked. And so we looked at that point and found out we were having a girl,
Oh.
which was like obviously so bittersweet.
Yeah.
And the only thing like I said, I really don't think we had a gender preference really. But when the NICU had talked to us, they kept asking us if it was a boy or a girl. And we finally were like, we don't know, but like, why? And they said, well, the statistics are like girls do a little bit better in the NICU. And I just remember finding out it was a girl and like feeling heartbroken that like maybe she would have been the miracle baby.
Yeah.
But, and so we uh, so sometime in there we heard about what our options were, and because she was so small, she was measuring like a 23 weeker at 26 and 6. And so they did give us the option that we could do a surgical procedure rather than induction, but that we want to go hold the baby and see the baby. And so I feel fortunate enough that I had not anyone like super close to me that had experienced stillbirth, certainly no one that I knew their experience well, but enough exposure a little bit that I just knew that people had always talked about like pictures and holding the baby being really helpful. So I feel grateful that I was able to know that to make the decision to be induced, so that we would get to hold her.
Yeah.
Um, and they gave us the option of we could go home, we could come back that night, we could come back the next day. Again, like my blood pressure was pretty high, but within a range that they were like, we have time if you want to prepare, whatever that means.
Yeah.
And we just decided that we couldn't imagine like going home and then having to come back. So we just got admitted straight to labor and delivery from the ultrasound.
Michelle,
And
did you end up
yeah,
calling your families or by
yeah,
this time, or was it a little bit later on?
I was trying to remember that. I think it was a little bit. I'm not totally sure. Sometime that morning we
Okay.
did. I'm not sure if it was when we were still downstairs or when we were up in labor and delivery. I know um, Chris like had called his dad because he needed him to come like pick up the dog and like take care of those kind of things. But yeah, I don't know. Sometime
Sometime.
during
Okay.
that morning we told people, but I it's a blur of when that happened.
Yeah.
We got admitted up to labor and delivery, and it was, I mean, it was just kind of the same thing again, sitting in that triage waiting room like with all these people who are so happy, and just like falling apart in the waiting room. And they had called to like make sure that they had a room for us and things. So I hoped that that meant that we would not have to wait in the waiting room. And unfortunately, we still did, not for a super long time, but and we didn't have to like do the check-in process, thankfully, but
Yeah.
we still had to sit in there for a little bit. And then they took us back to the room, and I worked at that hospital for my NICU and newborn rotation, so I had been to those labor and delivery rooms, and I knew that they were taking us to like the far back room, um, which I know was an act of kindness, so that we would be as far from like crying babies as we could. But it just was like another piece of reality that
Yeah.
um, they would never put a preemie baby that was going to be born alive in that far room because it's the farthest from the NICU. And so it was just really hard to be put there. And then, then I remember I suddenly became very fixated on eating. I was very hungry. um, I don't know, like I was just in shock, I guess. And I hadn't eaten breakfast that morning because I was so sick with anxiety. And I was like, they're like, okay, like you're only gonna be able to drink now, like clear liquids while you're being induced. And I was like, this is not gonna work. We need food. I because I in my head this was gonna take days and days.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah.
and so I yeah, I think Chris was a little bit alarmed at how fixated on food I was. But yeah, it's kind of a funny memory now. And ultimately, we ordered food from this restaurant like across the street from the hospital that we went to, and got good food, ate a lot of food, and yeah, that I don't know, that was just a funny light moment, I guess,
Yeah.
of a horrible day.
Yeah.
Um, and then I remember they were like, okay, well, just let us know. Like, once you're done eating, we can start induction. Um, and just like having to hit the call light to
Yeah.
say, like, I'm ready, uh, was hard. But I also didn't want to
Yeah.
I had a really wonderful, wonderful nurse, Corey. And I knew she wasn't going to keep coming in and asking, are you ready yet? So I knew I was going to have to call out at some point. And so we did that. We started the medications. And again, just thinking like I wasn't in any sort of preterm labor. So
Mhm.
we're starting from scratch.
Yeah.
And so it was going to be a while. Chris left to go. We didn't have a bag packed. We certainly
Yeah.
didn't bring it that day.
Yeah.
Um, and so he went home for a little bit and met his dad at our house to um, have him pick up the dog and everything and make sure he had what he needed. And fortunately we live close to the hospital too. But my one of my best friends, um she was also a resident with me, and she had a badge that worked at the hospital, and we hadn't really asked yet about guests. We knew that the visitor policy because of COVID was
Yeah.
two guests, or two visitors, but I hadn't really asked if there were any exceptions or anything. It hadn't occurred to me. And so she like came in with her badge so that she wouldn't have to be one of my visitors.
Oh.
And so she sat with me while Chris went home so that I wouldn't be alone, um, which was just so kind.
Yes, that is
Um,
yeah. That was kinda
and
lucky too.
yeah. And then I started getting really sick. Well, poor thing. She came to like just sit with me, which already I'm sure was like a lot to do. And then I started getting really sick from the induction meds while she
Mm.
was here. So after all that I had wanted to eat a ton of food, it turned out to not be worth it because it all came right back up.
Oh, no.
Uh, but that's a good friend.
Yes.
She was holding my hair back and really caring for me. Um, and then Chris came back shortly thereafter, and she left so we could be together. And then I don't know, it's kind of a blur. By then it's afternoon. I don't know kind of what happened that afternoon. Um, I remember, I guess kind of from the time we got to labor and delivery, just it felt like every person that walked in the room would ask us about if we wanted an autopsy, if we had a plan for what to do with her body, like all of these questions that just felt so overwhelming.
They're,
That
like, super heavy questions, and you're like,
Yeah,
"I'm not in the right state of mind to answer
yeah,
these questions. Why are you
yeah. And it
asking
was like
me?"
because it was like as it because we hadn't answered them yet, they kept needing because they couldn't fill out their forms or
Yeah.
whatever. And so then it made us feel like we had to decide. Everyone kept being like, oh no, you can wait to decide. But then the next person would ask us 10 minutes later. Um, and so yeah, that was just really, really overwhelming. And yeah, and that afternoon was, yeah, just a blur. I know we started to talk about names a little bit,
Mm.
and because we hadn't known it was a girl, so we hadn't decided on a name.
Did you
And
have a running list by then, though?
yeah, so we did. We had it down to two names for girls at that point. Neither of them is Lily. um, we had two names, and I remember actually, I think it was downstairs when we were still in the OB's office. When we found out it was a girl, we like very briefly talked about names, and now this feels so wrong, but it's just where I was at the time. That we both kind of felt like, well, we don't want to quote unquote waste our names on this baby that's not going to live, which is so insane to me now. But I'm so happy her name is Lily, so it
Yeah.
doesn't bother me at all in that sense because it feels like her name got to where it was supposed to be.
Because yes.
Um, but yeah, it's just like where we were that we just didn't understand. I don't know if we didn't understand like the depth of how much love we already had for her and would develop.
Continue,
But
yeah.
yeah, how do you know until you do it? But yeah, so I said to Chris, we kind of decided we weren't going to use either of those two names. And I think Lily had come up some point, and we had both been like, yeah, we like it, but it's not like it doesn't beat X name, whatever. Um, but sometime after that 23-week scan, when things were really bad, I had this like moment when I was just like doing something around the house, where I just had a moment where I thought, I think it's a girl, which is not something I had felt before. And I said, and I think her name is Lily. Like that just came to me in that moment. And it was just very odd. And yeah, didn't think a lot about it. But I guess it had stayed in my mind. And
Yeah.
then in the hospital, I said, well, I told Chris that. I don't even think I had told him that story yet.
Oh, wow.
And so I told him I that had happened and that I really liked the name Lily. and we looked up what the meaning of it was, and it means like pure and innocent. Like, that feels right.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah,
It's so beautiful.
thanks. Yeah, so we picked that sometime that afternoon. We still didn't know what her middle name was going to be. We were
Mhm.
um and then I started to get a lot more uncomfortable that afternoon, and the pain just started to get bad. I was still having side effects from all the induction meds and
Mm.
just like really not feeling well. I didn't want to get an epidural yet,
But
because in
you
my
were
head,
but you were okay getting an epidural at some
yeah,
point in time. Okay.
yeah, I was planning to get an epidural, um, and I like was planning to probably in any labor that I was gonna have, but
Okay.
I
Okay.
definitely planned to then. But for some reason, I just I think I thought the pain was gonna get worse. Like I wanted to save it for like uh like when things got really bad. Like that was where my mind was at. And so I was in a ton of pain, and I was like, but not the epidural yet. Like so I got an IV pain med instead, and it just like it helped a tiny bit with the pain, but mostly just like knocked me out.
Oh,
Um, which I got a couple hour nap probably, which was probably good for me.
yeah.
But then I was in this weird state where I was like awake, like I could hear everything happening, I could understand everything happening, but I like
Oh,
couldn't move or open my eyes really.
yeah.
So no one knew I was awake. And I just remember hearing like people coming in and out of the room and talking to Chris, and me like not really knowing who they were because I couldn't open my eyes to
Yeah.
see. And just like it was a very like weird Twilight Zone afternoon.
Yeah.
And I remember at one point, just like, again, like he thought I was still dead asleep because I appeared to be dead asleep. And he was just like sobbing in there at
Oh.
one point when no one was in there. Um, and that was just a really heartbreaking moment. Because he had been breaking down, like he definitely broke down in the ultrasound room. And but I know he was trying to be strong for me in ways too.
Yeah.
And trying to like do the logistic things, like get clothes at
Yeah.
home, and
Yeah.
um, so then to just hear that moment of him just falling apart when he thought I wasn't aware was really painful.
Yeah.
And then things went on. I still was super uncomfortable. And I remember my sweet, sweet nurse, she was about to leave for the night. And she had changed her schedule so that she could come back and be our nurse the next day, which was
Oh,
so kind.
yeah.
And we were just so relieved that we would have a familiar face, who had cared for us so well. And she said, okay, what's your pain on a scale of 1 to 10, where 10 is the worst pain in your life? And I said 7. And Chris goes, okay, I'm just curious, like, what's the worst pain you've had in your life? If not this. And I was like, oh, I mean, I think 12 hours from now, I imagine the pain will be worse. That's why I'm like, because I was only like 1 centimeter at that point.
Oh.
And I was
Oh.
like, I can't be in this much pain. Like,
This is
I'm just
yeah.
being a wimp. Like, anyway, so, but then he and my nurse Corey convinced me that it was going to work. Like, the pain relief was going to stay
Yeah.
for the next 12 hours if I got
Helpful.
the
It will
epidural.
be helpful.
Yeah. So I got the epidural, and they were right.
Yeah.
It was like, I mean, I know epidurals like vary and different, they work differently for different people at different
Yeah.
times, but I had a great epidural, and I
Oh,
immediately
good.
felt so much better
Oh,
and
good.
was like able to just like think and be present in a way that in some ways was really excruciatingly painful, but also was like really important to feel like I was actually there rather
Yeah.
than just coping through the
Yeah.
pain.
Yeah.
Um, yeah, so got the epidural. That was good. And then we could like, figure out a middle name
Yeah.
because
I can think straight,
I was
kind
like
of.
actually a person.
Yeah.
Um, and then the next time they came in to check me was a few hours later. And then I was 9 centimeters. So I was like, okay, so that's why I hurt so much, because I was like was only 1 centimeter, but I was about to be 9.
Oh
Um,
my goodness, that was fast.
yeah, it went really fast. And yeah, so that made me feel justified in the epidural. And I was glad I already had it. So I was
Yep.
like, oh shoot. But then I also just remember thinking like, oh, 9 centimeters, like that's so close to 10. Like I'm gonna have to push soon. Like we're gonna have to do this soon, and just feeling really overwhelmed about facing that. Because I in my head, and especially because it had been going so slow in the afternoon, that I was like, it's gonna be another 24 hours at least.
Yeah.
Um, so that was like also it was overwhelming.
Yeah.
Um,
Did you feel like, at least for me, I kind of I
yeah,
didn't want that labor to go that fast because I kind of wanted to have my baby with me still. I don't know if that's a feeling
yeah.
you had or if it was
Yeah,
yeah.
I definitely think there was some of that, and I would think I was also really afraid. Not necessarily like I was looking forward to seeing my baby, but I was also just like really afraid.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I think yeah, I think kind of what you're saying, like it also felt like that was the end. And I
Yeah.
didn't want to get to the end.
I didn't want yeah.
Yeah. So yeah. But it went fast anyway. um and and then it was like 3 a.m. or so, and they came in to check. So I mean, close to 24 hours then after we had came to our appointment, and they said, you're 10 centimeters, do you want to push? And I still to this day I'm kind of confused about what I was being asked. I'm like, I don't want, like I don't
Yeah.
know I had an option. Once I was
Yeah.
fully dilated, I was super comfortable. Like I
Mm,
didn't feel an urge to push with, because my epidural was really doing the trick.
mhm.
But I was like, I I don't know. And they're like, okay, well let's try. And then they just had me push like a couple of times, and then they said, let's give you a break and we'll come back in 4 hours. I was like, oh, okay. Okay.
Oh,
They're like,
okay.
try not like pressing your epidural button for a while to see if like you can feel the contractions more. And I was like, okay. And then they came back in an hour and said, let's try again. And I was like, okay,
Okay.
uh, whatever. So um yeah, so then at that point, we started pushing, and or I started pushing, and I had asked Chris that time because it had been just so quiet in the room the first couple times I tried to push. And so I asked Chris to play some music um while I pushed the
Mm,
second time. And so he put on some like bluegrass instrumental music on his phone, which we just like bluegrass a lot. And um so that was nice. But pushing was just like really emotionally horrible for me. I, the word daughter didn't occur to me until that moment, because we I had just been referring to baby as my baby and not as son or daughter, because I didn't know.
yeah.
And even in the 12 hours since we found out it was a girl, like the word daughter just hadn't occurred to me. Um, and I just remember thinking, I'm gonna get a hold of my daughter. Um, and it just broke my heart all over again. Um, I don't really know why, but I just distinctly remember like that thought being really hard. Um, and and I also just would fall apart between every push, or between every contraction. I was just sobbing, and it was just so quiet. And like again, like I've been in a lot of deliveries to attend them, to take care of living babies, and I just know that that's not, occasionally you're in one where the vibe is just very quiet, but usually there people are really encouraging, and there's just a
Yeah.
lot of talk. Um, and it was just so quiet. And I didn't have to push for too long. I mean, she was also very tiny.
Yeah.
Um, so it I don't know how long I pushed, maybe 10 or 15 minutes. And then she was born at about 4:15 in the morning
In the
on
morning.
September 8th.
what was your plan? Did they give you preferences or plans for after she was born?
Yeah, I guess that was another thing in their, like, list of things they kept asking us is they kept asking, "What oh, do you wanna bathe her? Do you wanna take picture" like, what are all the things? And we had tended to just say yes to all of those things. Those felt like the easier question. We were like,
Yeah.
"It doesn't feel right in the moment, we can say no," but, um so I had said that I wanted to hold her right away, and so they put her in my arms right away, and it was just the best and the worst moment ever.
Yeah.
She was so, so, so little. She weighed 1 pound and 1 ounce, and she was 11 and a quarter inches long, so she was a
Oh,
really tiny nugget, um,
yeah.
but she was just so perfect. Uh, and again, I know this is I don't know if this was your experience, but I feel like I hear from so many moms, like, the silence at when the baby's born too is just crushing.
It's the worst.
Yeah, uh, so, yeah, that was just another crushing moment, but the love I felt for her when I got to see her was just so intense. Yeah. And then I feel like they just, like, kinda clean clean things up as quickly as they could, and then everyone kinda left, which was fine, and it was just me and Chris, um, and just, staring at her. I again, time who knows what time even was, but, it feels like for the first couple hours that I just held her and we just stared at her, and I feel like for a while I was afraid to even touch her, aside from holding her, because like, she was so little and
Yeah.
I was so in shock, and then, like, slowly just getting more comfortable, um, just holding her and kissing her and, just seeing all the little features of her body. But yeah, I feel like it was like she was born at 4, and I wanna say it was, like, until daylight that it was just, like, us in there just staring at her,
Oh,
with no one else there, which was really special time.
yeah.
Um, and then daylight came and, um, then our nurse from the day before came back, which was really nice,
Oh, yeah.
and one of the things that they had asked us when we first came in was there's a really great organization in Pittsburgh, called the Pittsburgh Bereavement Doulas, and they volunteer their services, bereavement doulas for anyone experiencing a stillbirth. So they had asked if we wanted a bereavement doula, and we were like, don't know what that means, but sure.
Yes.
Um,
Mm.
so we had said yes, and she actually was one of the people who had come in uh, while I was asleep the afternoon before and introduced herself to Chris and had offered to stay, and he was like, I think it's okay, like, you can kinda come, and she was like, "I'm available if you need to call me, like, call me this evening, otherwise I'll come back in the morning." So she came back in the morning, um, and she was wonderful, and it was so helpful, because she was able to help us kind of figure out what kind of memories we would
Oh,
make in that day, and it's like you are losing a lifetime of memories, and we can try to create as many of those as possible in today. And so many things that she facilitated, or just ideas that she had that just wouldn't have occurred to us, especially like I literally think Chris
yeah.
and I would have just sat there and stared at her, which also would have been a beautiful day.
Yeah.
Um, but it was really nice to kind of have someone coming up with ideas, of things that would feel special. So we said we had looked forward to reading books with our baby. And so she brought in a bunch of children's books so that we could read them to her. And she suggested playing music that was important to us. So we like played our wedding song
Oh.
um and then I'm sure Chris will talk about this, but his favorite thing I think is she recommended doing like a father-daughter dance to a song. So he like
Oh.
danced around with her. It was so, so sweet.
Yeah.
And so now he gets to have a song that's like their song.
Yeah.
Um, and we made footprints and handprints and She did a baptism. Um, and and then one like funny Pittsburgh thing, she was like, is she a Pittsburgh baby? And we were like, I guess. Like, I mean, she was born here. Like, I'm not a Pittsburgher in like
Yeah.
native, but
Yeah.
Chris is. And there's, I don't know if you watch football at all, but there's the Steelers
Yeah.
have terrible towels with like the yellow towels that they wave in the stands. And she was like, well, this is a Pittsburgh baby. We need to get a terrible towel. And then she took it upon herself. She went to like 5 places. Like it wasn't easy to find. Um, but we were like, it's really okay.
That's
It's okay.
hilarious.
And so then we have pictures of her wrapped in a
Oh.
terrible towel,
Oh.
which is pretty funny.
Yeah, that's
Um,
great.
yeah. And then one of the best things that she encouraged us to do, didn't really push us to do, but kind of strongly encouraged us to consider, was inviting people to come.
Mm,
Um, Chris and I tend to be pretty private people, and I think we just like didn't know if that was a thing that you invited people to
right.
come to.
Yeah, the social norms of like, yeah,
Yeah.
this is
Yeah.
weird. This is weird.
Yeah. And I think if I had delivered a living baby, I think I probably would have been like, we'll just have it be us in the hospital. Like, so it didn't
Mhm.
really, I don't know. I just wasn't sure what to do. And so she encouraged us to invite people. And I was like, I don't know. Is anyone going to want to come? Does anyone
Yeah.
like want to come see a dead baby? And of course, my family was in Colorado. But we called Chris's parents and we were like, well, I mean, if you want to. And they were like, we'll be there. We'll leave in
Yeah.
5 minutes. And his mom was at work and she like left work immediately to come down. And that was really special to get to have
Oh,
them
good.
meet her and get to like, I don't know. I think in my head, I was afraid that she was so beautiful to me. And I was afraid that if someone came and had a negative reaction to her, that it would crush me.
Yeah. Yeah. Yes. Valid worry, I think.
Yeah. Yeah. But instead they came and they like, I mean, they were heartbroken, but they also just like thought she was beautiful.
Oh,
And so that was so validating for my heart.
yeah.
And then we were like, well, that was great. Let's invite Chris's sisters. um, so one of them unfortunately was out of town. But the other one, same thing. We were like, I mean, if you want to. And she was like, I'm getting in my car right now. So she came as well, which was really nice. And then kind of throughout, so that was, I mean, by the time they all came, and it was like late afternoon on that day, um, and we had started to notice that her body was changing a little bit. And we just felt they hadn't given us any sort of timeline. I don't know if the
Yeah.
hospital has a timeline for how long they would have
Yeah.
let us stay with her, but none was told to us. So we felt like we were empowered to make whatever decision. And they had like not a true cuddle cot that keeps
Yeah.
the babies really cold, but they had like
Like a cooling pad.
yeah, they had like a
Yeah.
cooling pad.
Okay.
But we just didn't ever want to put her down. So we kept putting
Yeah.
her on the cooling pad and then we would just like pull her right back out of the
Yeah.
crib.
Yeah.
So it wasn't very effective because we didn't use it. um, but so we kind of decided that we were afraid that if we stayed for another night with her, that her body would change too much. And I don't know, it felt like for us, it felt like caring for her to choose that like we didn't want her body to keep changing.
Yeah.
And so we decided that we were going to say goodbye to her that night. And Chris and they had given us like a booklet of like recommended readings and scriptures and songs. And Chris and I like had our own little, we called it like our own little memorial, that we like went through a bunch of those together that evening, and
Oh, good.
just told her how much we loved her. It was just a really nice time together. And then it was finally like, I don't know, probably 11 p.m. We decided that we were as ready as we might be to say goodbye. And another thing, there was a lot of things that have been donated to this hospital for babies who are stillborn, which we're so grateful for. And one of them was this little tiny bassinet thing, just for her size, like
Oh,
a little
really?
crocheted or knitted
Yeah.
bassinet. And it had like a parent keepsake. So that the idea was that the baby would go in that and that you would keep the matching
Yeah.
one. And so we left her there in that, and we chose to like walk her down the hall to the room where we were going to leave her rather than them taking her away from us.
Yeah.
That was yet another horrible moment.
Yeah.
And then I luckily, since I was recovering well, they also let me get discharged that night.
Oh,
Because
okay.
if I didn't have her, I didn't want to be there. And so they discharged us like in the middle of the night, and which was probably a blessing in a lot of ways to be able to leave the hospital lobby that's always so full of like happy babies in car seats.
Yes.
And it was just empty. Um, and yeah, so then we went home.
And you guys had been up also, right?
Yeah.
Basically for a couple days. I mean,
Yeah.
I'm sure you
Yeah.
didn't
There'd
get
been
very
like a
much,
little bit of
maybe a
napping
nap or
sort of
two.
in there, but like, yeah,
You're probably exhausted. Oh.
yeah, we were so tired.
So you guys went home and did you guys so you did kind of a memorial service at the hospital together. Did you guys decide how if you were planning on burying her or cremating her, or what was the plan?
Yeah. So we ultimately thought we just struggled with it a lot.
Yeah.
Um, and what we ultimately decided, one of the options they gave us was that the hospital could take care of cremation, and
Yeah.
a local funeral home would like spread her ashes. And so we opted for that.
Yeah.
And it was fun. It was something I kind of struggled with for a while, of like feeling a little guilty that we didn't get to keep her, that we didn't have a gravestone to go visit or ashes to like an urn to keep
To have.
special.
Mhm.
And about 6 or 7 months after she was born, I was talking to my therapist about that, and she said, well, do you think it would be helpful to know where what cemetery she's at? And I said, yeah, but I'm not allowed to know. Like, I signed the paper that said I don't get to know. And she was like, well, I know people, like, I know someone that's in the funeral, like, business here, and it's a small community. Do you want me to find out? And I
Oh,
was like, I would like you to find out if you can. And then the next day she emailed me and had found out what cemetery she's
oh,
at. And it's right by Chris's parents. It's not super close to us. It's like 45 minutes from us, but it's really close to to his parents. So now we have a place that we can go visit her and feel
oh,
like she's there.
yeah. That is
Yeah.
really nice. That
Yeah.
was really nice of your therapist too. Like,
I know. She's a good one.
yeah, seriously. Oh, I know that like we will talk about this on our other episode, but I imagine that coming home and being home was quite rough
Mhm.
for a bit.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
Um, I will say one thing, that I had reached out to some of my friend who had come to like be with me in the hospital, as well as a couple other friends. And I just said, I don't know what I physically need to recover from birth. Like, I didn't research that. I haven't done this before. I said, can you figure it out and get me the supplies? And none of them have kids. So they didn't know. Um, and I said, just like buy whatever things I need. So when we came home from the hospital in the middle of the night on our porch, there was this whole huge basket of like all the supplies I needed to recover from giving birth, for like
Oh.
helping with my milk coming in,
Oh.
and then like comfy pajamas and chocolate and teas, and I'm sure so many other things. But it was just so kind. And I just remember being like, the best friends are the ones that buy you diapers on the worst day of your life.
Yeah.
Yeah. So, yeah, but it was, I mean, it was really, really horrible for a long. I mean, it's still so hard, but
Yeah.
um, those early days are just incredibly challenging.
Yeah. Michelle, thank you so much for sharing Lily's story. Oh, I do have two last questions, actually. I
Oh
was thinking
yeah.
about it. I was like, so when did you guys decide on Grace then,
Oh
the
yeah.
middle name? Because I know you were considering it.
Yeah. We sometime literally in the middle of the night, before she was born, we had been like, we were literally Googling names of like, and trying to figure out like, oh, what sounds nice with Lily? And like, we're trying out some of the other names that we had talked about on our list. And we're like, oh, does this go good as a middle
Hmm.
name? No, no. And then we kept looking at like the meanings of names, and we were like, oh, like Grace would be like like that would be a nice meaning. What names mean Grace? And then we're like, we could just do Grace.
Yeah. Let's just do
So,
that. Yeah.
so yeah, that's how we picked it.
It's so beautiful. It's such a
Oh,
pretty name
thanks.
and it has got beautiful rhythm and
Yeah.
and then tell me one thing that you want to remember about Lily and about this entire experience.
What I want to remember and what I would want other people to remember is that Lily is more than just the fact that she died. Um, like that happened and it's horrible, but she is also was also beautiful and perfect, and she's my daughter, and she always will be. I'm so proud of that.
Thank you so much.
Thank you so much for letting me talk about her. I love to.